Hello. Are we live? We're out there? It looks like we're live.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Ken.
And everyone's all right, letting people, we just opened the floodgates. I see all the people coming in. Fantastic. Thanks for being here, internet friends. Thanks for being here, Brian. Thanks for setting this up, New Republic. This is very cool. I'm really glad that everyone's here to talk about one of the best books of the year. Um, I'm supposed to introduce myself. I'm Kim Kelly. I'm an author. I wrote a couple books about labor. A new one is coming out May 6th. It's a young readers edition of my first book, Fight Like Hell, Untold History of American Labor, because you got to get them young, right? I'm also a freelance journalist and, I'm around. And Brian, you have a very illustrious bio. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to make sure I don't miss anything.
Uh, Kim, it is so good to be doing this with you. As I said a moment ago before we went on, I am like truly overwhelmed with gratitude that like today's publication day and that I get to be doing this with you. So, and those books you referenced that you like brushed over really quickly are like Fight Like Hell is an absolutely essential book. Everyone should buy this while they're watching this video. Anyway, I'm Brian Goldstone. I am an author now, as of today. I'm a journalist. I'm also an anthropologist by training, and yeah, I was writing magazine stories for several years. One of which was a piece for New Republic called "The New American Homeless." That was kind of the genesis for this book, and so I'm also incredibly grateful to TNR for giving me the resources to report that story for I think like 7 or 8 months. Um, that was truly a transformative experience, and it is what led me to want to write this book and to feel like this was something that had to be investigated and delved into further. And yeah, my book, There's No Place for Us, is out today. And I assume we'll be talking about it a little bit. So, um, yeah, so that's me.
That is you. Well, yeah, publication day is super exciting. I know everyone hasn't got a chance to read the book yet, so we won't give out too many spoilers, but I do want to kind of dig into it because I got
Yeah,
to read it a little while ago, and it is beautiful, it is depressing, it is just the kind of book that makes me mad because I'm like, oh, why can't I write that? But it's a great book. And it's a really important book too. Like I feel like when you hear, oh, it's a really important book, you think of something really dry and boring, but this isn't that kind of book. Like this will hit you right in the guts. And
mm,
to start off, I want to ask you, I kind of want to start with the title, with the very
yeah,
beginning, specifically the subtitle, Working and Homeless in America.
yeah,
This is something the people you follow in the book, they're not primarily living on the streets. They're living in motels or with family or in halfway houses. Their kids go to school, they go to work. They
yeah,
don't fit this sort of stereotypical idea of a homeless person, a houseless person, someone with no place to go that I think is kind of the overarching idea.
totally.
But there are a lot of people who are living like this. And like you said in the book and really showed, it's a very invisibilized population. Like we don't even, like you said, we don't even really have accurate numbers for how many people are in this situation. So to start off, I wanted to see if you could kind of break that down a little bit and tell us about first some of those misconceptions around like what homelessness looks like and how that applies to what you actually found throughout the course of this investigation and what kind of is really happening in cities like Atlanta and all over.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, part of why I wrote this book after reporting that New Republic story is because I was just absolutely stunned to discover that, what we see on the street, like as bad as it is in many cities in terms of like the number of people who have been deprived of housing and stable shelter. And we see kind of the proliferating encampments, and we also see now the militarized crackdown on people whose only crime is not being able to afford rent in a growing number of American cities. We see that criminalization. All of that is like visible to us. And I was stunned to discover that that is like the way I have come to describe it is that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's like there's this entire world of homelessness under the water's surface, as it were, like that we just don't see. And just like with an iceberg, like that actually constitutes the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in America. And the overwhelming number of them are an overwhelming number of them are families with kids. Even in the 80s, like when mass homelessness was first exploding in the US under Reagan's neoliberal revolution and kind of the wholesale decimation of not only public housing and rental assistance, but the social safety net in general. When mass homelessness was emerging at that time, even then, with all the sensationalized media accounts of, that a lot of it revolved around a story about deinstitutionalization and mental illness and addiction and alcoholism and, all these things that now feel very familiar to us as stereotypes about who is unhoused and why. Even at that time, the fastest growing segment of the homeless population in the US were children under the age of 6. So from like the very beginning, there's been this not just invisible, but I like how you put it, invisibilized world that has been very deliberately and intentionally kept out of view. And it's not just like out of view physically. These are people who have been excluded from the official counts and how we like actually tabulate and measure homelessness in America. Um, and just on that real quick, I mean, what I argue in the book is that, or show, document, is that the actual number of people experiencing homelessness in America right now is a conservative estimate about 6 times bigger than like what the point in time count showed this most recent year, which was about 740,000 people. So we're talking about like a population that's about 6 times if you include the families, people like the families I write about in my book. So like the families I write about, none of them would be actually counted in that annual homeless census. They would all be rendered invisible. But it's not just a matter of how we count. It's also, it affects like our understanding of what homelessness is and what causes it. Because if you widen the lens and you start to reckon with the reality of people working not just one job, but like multiple jobs, and they still can't remain housed in not just like New York or LA, but a growing number of American cities, including Atlanta, then it forces us to rethink in a very radical way, not just the word homeless and that term working homeless, but work too. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you, because it's astonishing how rare qu- conversations of labor and the changing nature of work in America, how rare it is to bring that into discussion with homelessness and housing, which is just like wild because we have this kind of platitude of like that incomes aren't catching up with rents, but we always go very quickly to the rent part of that and not the income part of that. We have to do both. We have to talk about, and not just wages, but the increasing precarity of work itself, the gigification of work, the contracting out of. So anyway, that's what this whole population sort of consists of, are people who, many of whom have jobs, more than one. There's a lot of kids. And yeah, the places where they're living are not shelters or on the street, which is how the government defines homelessness very narrowly. Shelters or street. Um, a big part of what the book is trying to do is shine a light on the proliferation of these extended stay hotels that have just become like the new frontier of not only exploitation and preying on people's desperation, but kind of the new frontier of just housing precarity in general, because these hotels are effectively shelter of last resort, and they're but you're not a tenant, you're not a renter when you're there. It's this kind of gray zone, and I would argue that the tens of thousands or actually hundreds of thousands of families and individuals living in these hotels are some of the most vulnerable homeless people in America because they're both locked out of homeless services and don't sort of qualify for the even minimal protections that other tenants would have. So they're kind of just left in this sort of zone of abandonment. And that's why I spend a lot of time on those sites in the book.
That really just makes me think about like this population of people, like you said, they're locked out of having any rights as renters. They're locked out of being able to access proper housing. They're locked out of all of these potential benefits from the government, what's left of it. But they're also just thinking through some of the jobs that you describe in the book that folks are working. It's like low wage jobs, temporary jobs, temp work, fast food. Those are jobs without a lot of labor protections. So they're also going without protection of labor laws, of unions. A lot of the folks in this situation have been impacted by the mass incarceration system. So that is another huge barrier to getting housing, to getting that job, to getting everything you need. It's it it is kind of crushing to think about, just so many things piled on top of it. But the biggest, most basic need of having a place to live.
Yeah, totally. I just real quick on that, like, I mean, one of the I guess productive things or one of the fruitful things about a book as opposed to like a magazine story, even like a long form story, is that you can really show in narrative form how all of these systems sort of converge to create this this rampant insecurity and really to create this crisis. But I also want to be really clear that even though it's this multiplicity of factors, like it's not this matter of like, well, who's to say which one of those was decisive in them becoming, home. No, like the reason people are homeless is because they don't have homes that they can afford and because they're not safe and they're not stable. Like that's it. And but then all these other systems and factors kind of, including a lack of health care, that some of the main families in the book, like for example, one woman in the book, Celeste, is diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer. And she has to decide because she's working at a warehouse with no labor protections, as you said, no sick leave, no benefits. She has to decide, is she going to like go to her appointments for treatment or go to the warehouse and get her paycheck? If she chooses the treatment, she's not going to have money to like pay her rent at this squalid hotel because you have to pay your rent weekly, and if you could be locked out immediately if you don't pay your rent. So it's like all of like that, that's healthcare. That's a lack of a safety net when it comes to health insurance. It's also a lack of sick leave and benefits. But ultimately, the reason she's in that position at that hotel is because she was first pushed into homelessness by the very sort of nature of our housing system and our rental market.
Right. There's this awful narrative that people who are homeless are there because they did something bad. They made a mistake. They took the wrong thing. They went down the wrong path. And that is just so mean and
Hmm.
inaccurate. And I
Yeah.
think this book really kind of shows it. I mean, every person, no matter what is going on, deserves a home.
Yeah.
These folks, they're sort of the, if I was like a conservative dickhead, I would say these are like the deserving homeless, like these
Mm-hmm.
folks are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
They're sending their kids to school, they're going to work, but they're still not getting ahead. So
Totally.
how is that? Must be something in the water. Like clearly
Yeah.
that can't be anybody else's fault. But before I
Yeah.
get on the soapbox, I really wanted to dig in a little bit in the process of making this book happen because writing a
Mm.
book is a big deal. Like you said, it's
Mhm.
something that will last. You have some room, you have some time to dig into it. And this feels like it took a lot of time and a
Mm.
lot of doing to make this book happen. It started off as a magazine piece and then you expanded it into this big, beautiful, very thick book that just came out today. So I want to know how you did this. To start, how did you meet the families in the book? Like, what was
Mm.
there a specific criteria you were looking for? Are these like friends that you had? Like, how did you find our new friends?
Yeah. Yeah. So in some ways, the book really developed kind of organically out of this New Republic story because while I was reporting that piece in Atlanta, where the book is also based, and I was following one family who, easily could have been in the book, but, because her story also was just like so paradigmatic of what the book is trying to show in terms of she was living in a gentrifying neighborhood called Peoplestown in Atlanta, and her landlord was an investor who also ran a humanitarian mission in West Africa. So it's like giving charity abroad, brutalizing tenants here. But decided, like, had bought this home as an investment, waiting for the neighborhood to come up. Once the neighborhood came up, terminated the lease of this family who was like stably housed, paying their rent, ideal tenants. And by the time I met them, they had been homeless for several months. Despite Kokethia, which is the woman's name in the story, despite her job as a home health aide. So anyway, like while I was reporting that story, I was like following them to food pantries and meetings with caseworkers and you know, you name it, trying to get like assistance from the homeless service agencies here in Atlanta. And in the course of doing that, going to church with them, all this stuff, that's kind of my, for better or worse, like I have very few boundaries as a journalist in terms of like, okay, I'm going to drop in, get the story, and write it. I think this is my background as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer. Like I want to just like go in fully, even if it financially as a freelancer makes no sense. And it's just like an excessive amount of time. But in this case, like all that extra time and reporting, and meeting all these families and volunteers and caseworkers on the side that didn't even make it into that article, it kind of yielded this abundance of sources when it came time to start the book project. And so I already had kind of a running start with like meeting people and I had church volunteers saying, oh, you need to talk to this family. And one thing I'll say about this project is I know there are certain projects where like it's really hard to find the right the right people. Uh did my screen just go really dark by any chance? Do I still okay, because it just got like dark in this room. Um there are some journalists who it's like hard to find the protagonist you're looking for because it's this really particular investigation you're doing or expose or whatever. In my case, one thing about housing insecurity and kind of like the rise of the working homeless is like it's not a matter of not having enough people. It's a matter of there are so many families and individuals who are experiencing this. So that was not the problem. The problem was really just how to like of all the people I was meeting and eventually kind of embedding myself at this place, Efficiency Lodge, this extended stay hotel. Um, of all of the families and individuals I was meeting, who was willing to like have this random guy just be around all the time and to have the kind of access and really intimacy with their lives that I knew the reporting would require, that the book would require, because it was so important to me in the book to not just like talk about these issues in this abstract way, but to have readers feel viscerally what it feels like and looks like and smells like and just the texture of life when for kids for their parents when this most basic necessity is always out of reach. So I knew that was sort of the bar I was trying to whatever that was the goal. And it was a long process of because there were several people, families who I even followed for weeks or even months, and it just ended up like usually they didn't have any space in their life. They were in such an acute state of emergency and crisis. They just had no room to like talk to me. And that's absolutely understandable. So the people I ended up including in the book or featuring the book that I ended up really sticking with for the long term were, I think, in every case, this sounds super, whatever, presumptuous, arrogant, problematic. But I think in some ways they needed me around. Like they needed just to like talk, to have someone to call at 1 in the morning and vent about this shitty, you know, the shitty hotel manager, or just because part of the nature of being in this predicament is not having much of a support network. And so I kind of became that for people, I think, in a way. They didn't see me in many ways as like a journalist. They didn't have experience with journalists or writers, and I was just kind of the guy who was like there and could talk. And so I think in some ways it was kind of a mutually, I don't know, like we were just kind of agreeing, like, okay, we're going to be in this together for a while.
And that's so, it makes me think of some of the stories I've reported where I've kind of showed up, random tattooed white girl who just puts her nose in someone's business, and eventually they're like, no, no, come on, we're going to the bar, like, or come over,
Yeah,
'cause my mom was
yeah,
to me. Things like
yeah,
when you kind
yeah,
of there's this idea that journalists are supposed to be objective and not get too involved with their subjects and just be
yeah,
out here, and like that's not real. Not
totally.
if you
Yeah.
care. And though, and hearing you talk about this, it does make me wonder just sort of how, like, it's hard enough to get folks to talk to journalists in general, even just for a news story, because like you said,
Hmm.
a lot of people talk to us and they have a lot of opinions about us, which is fair. Like, how do you convince, or how do you get to that point, like build that relationship with someone who is in such a challenging point in their life, who is dealing with their own emotions and mental load and that of their partner and their children? How do you get them to be like, all right, this guy I can trust, this guy, like, this is a story I want to get out there, like it, because you went really deep, like this is
Hmm.
very personal,
Hmm.
emotional stories,
Hmm.
like
Yeah,
these are the lowest points of someone's year, if not, their last few years that you're there
yeah,
for.
yeah, yeah.
How do you get folks to trust you with that?
I mean, I'm curious to hear how you do it too. I mean, I mean, from reading Fight Like Hell, from knowing a little bit, like even how Sarah Nelson describes you in the opening, the forward to that, but like, which kind of clicked at like, okay, that's because I was sort of getting a glimpse into, okay, this is Kim Kelly's not just persona, like in her reporting world, but her methodology. So I'm curious to hear how it is for you too. But I suspect that it's kind of similar in that, like, as journalists, there's always a lot of questions like, do you intervene in the situations, or do you remain sort of above the fray, and do you give money, do you speak out, as an activist, or are you just there to observe? Those are all, I'm not trying to minimize those questions because they're all like really important questions, and I don't think it's just easy to resolve it one way or another. But I think more than like, in terms of how I met these families and just developed relationships with them. I mean, it was a reporting relationship, but it was also a relationship of I think mutual care and carefulness and dignity. The way that started often, and this is why I mentioned the whole like intervening thing, is I didn't present myself as, I'm just curious, I'm interested in observing your life, or I'm interested in documenting your experience, like this, I'm interested in being a fly on the wall. Like, I didn't say that. What I said was, you know um a lot of people going, like, living in this place, I've noticed there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of like self-blame. Do you ever like, it would like develop, like, I wouldn't just like come out and be like, do you feel ashamed? But, we would just, how long have you been here? What's life like? Where do you work? And, very quickly people are like, yeah, I lost my rental house that I was in because my landlord refused to fix the hot water heater, not for days or weeks, but months. And me and my kids couldn't bathe or take showers. And I refused to pay the rent. So they evicted us because in Georgia, you can't withhold rent even if the conditions are abysmal and the apartment is uninhabitable. So we got evicted. We ended up in this hotel. And you just hear sometimes in even the way that's narrated, like shame, like, even though they can sort of see like, okay, this wasn't my fault, they still, a lot of the people, that was one of the hardest things in doing this reporting, was seeing how much people just blame themselves when it's so clear that all of these external forces are militating against their existence and their survival. And so it just sort of started like that, this kind of like human rapport of like, you know what, I just have to say, like, and I'm not even saying this as a journalist, I'm just saying this as a human, it's not your fault. The way you just described that, it's not your fault. And, you know, and I think it's important that people see that. And if you wouldn't mind, I would love to just like get to know you more and hear more of your story. And yeah, I'm working on this project because I'm a lot of this just remains hidden and it needs to be brought out into the open. So it would sort of start like that. And yeah, and then like 2 years later, we're yeah, still not that there wasn't a lot of, people ghosting me for weeks at a time, or their phones get shut off and I don't hear from them. And I think I'm never going to see or speak to them again. And then they reappear. There was a lot of what we could euphemistically call vicissitudes in like the process of doing this reporting.
People can tell when you care. Like this,
Yeah.
it sounds so basic, but as a labor reporter, like things tend to be like the stories that I'm covering, people I'm talking to are also maybe having a hard time, but they have a little bit more of a cushion usually. But they're still like wanting people to listen. They want
Yeah.
people to hear their problems and to see them because there's even if you do have a home, so much of the work and so many of the workers that live in this country are invisibilized,
Yeah.
don't notice or don't care, and they feel like that. But you feel like you
Yeah.
said, people feel shame and stigma, like, oh, I should
Yeah.
be doing better. I should be doing this.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah.
what we're taught, and it's like you.
Can I just want to ask you, like, is like how, like, is solidarity for you part of your reporting method?
Oh yeah, I'm like, so I'm incredibly biased. That's my thing.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
pretend.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like I came into this type of journalism in sort of a wonky way. Like I never went to journalism school. I didn't finish college, any of that. I've come from the music world. Like I've been
Yeah.
a music journalist forever. And
Yeah.
I only started writing about labor when we unionized my workplace years ago. So I kind of entered into this type of reporting as a worker, like as someone who was intimately involved. And then I kind
Mm-hmm.
of figured out like, okay, writing about death metal is not that much different from writing about strikes. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I ended up in these positions, I'm not. Uh, it probably helps a little bit that I don't like look like a square. Like I'm covered in tattoos. Like I'm from like a
Yeah.
real blue collar background. I've got a
Yeah.
mouth on me. Like I might not look exactly like the people I'm interviewing, but I probably remind them of like their weird niece or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that are probably people, especially people who are being kind of stomped on or feel like they're being isolated. I feel like if you look a little bit different or look like you're outside of the mainstream, or at least look like someone who's not gonna try and talk down to them or look down, someone who looks like they've lived a life,
Yeah.
we're often more open to
Yeah.
talking. Like I feel like
Totally.
if I looked different, I came from a different world, I would have a different experience doing the reporting I do. But
Yeah. Do you
no.
allow your politics to just like be upfront when, I mean, I've noticed that, or maybe this is my outsider sense of labor, like the best labor reporters, but they're like pretty openly on the side of labor. Like they're not like pretending to just, well, we need to hear from the bosses too. Like maybe there's a good reason why people are peeing in jugs when they're delivering boxes. Like, is that something particular to labor reporting, do you think, where there's just this openness about your politics?
I think it is really difficult to be effective as a labor journalist and kind of not be coming from that background. But even if you come into this the most like generic apolitical person, hearing those stories and just seeing the dynamic, like it's kind of impossible to not be on the workers' side. Just,
Yeah,
just like it's like if someone asks you, like, oh, don't you want to ask the hotel boss or the landlords or the gentrifiers in Atlanta? Like, well, their perspective matters too. And like, no, it
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal will interview them. Like they're fine. The stories that you tell in this book and that I try to tell, those aren't necessarily going to be on page A1 of the Times.
yeah, yeah,
Should be, but
yeah.
we're here.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, I think it would have been possible, maybe. This is kind of a theoretical question, I guess, but like is it possible to like tell the stories, like because so much of this book, there's an introduction that's like 5 pages long, and there's an epilogue that's maybe 10 pages. And in both of those, there's more like explicit analysis and argument. And I am allowing myself to speak in my own voice. I I mean, I don't think that the what is in the middle of it is like just narrative, because the decision of like what detail to include or what context to give to why this hot water heater could be allowed to go unfixed, and this person could lose their, all of those are political decisions as much as they're writerly decisions, right? But I also wonder like about that moment where we do allow ourselves to speak in our own voice in the first person, and to say like, this is what we need, this is what has to happen, this is why we're in this absolutely this awful situation to begin with. It's for like, this is, I'm not just kind of observing things, right? And yeah, I don't know, maybe that's just a statement. I kind of struggled with that. Like, do I need to kind of tell the stories and let them just sort of sit on their own, or do I need to like make sure that I'm grabbing people and saying like, no, A, B, C, like this is this is why, and this is how we get out of this.
I think that's part of the job. Like, because you can tell, like, telling stories is crucial, but without that added context and maybe that added little push, be like, no, this is why it's like this, and this it doesn't have to be like this. I think
Yeah,
having like, breaking the fourth wall can be useful for the reader because it
yeah,
adds that context, and
yeah,
also
yeah,
it shows that you're I think it's like in this book and like in the best kind of books like this, you have to show that you care because otherwise sometimes it can feel a little extractive,
yeah.
like telling these people's stories, laying their lives out bare and then just walking off. I feel like that wouldn't hit the same way. Like I
One,
like reading those kinds of books because it feels like, okay, you got there, you got what you needed, and now you're just gonna like float away to the next thing. This is you,
yeah.
it's clear that you care about this. And you
And
know,
that was honestly, that was the hardest thing in this whole process. Like, I think even, I mean, the reporting itself, like witnessing up close this brutality, like this this violence, just like really seeing it up close, and even realizing how little my own presence like made a difference when they're like bringing, and this is sort of a spoiler, but bringing this like armed militia to a hotel during the pandemic because they can't go through the courts to evict people, to put them out. So they're just going to bring in this like private military squad and go up and point weapons in families' faces and force them out of their rooms. Like, I was shocked at how little my presence, as sometimes as journalists, we like to think like, oh, well, they're going to like be on their best behavior. No, I don't think that made any difference. But one of the hardest things in this process was like actually having to step away to start writing. And I was so present and available all the time, like in this as much as humanly possible kind of way, just like with people constantly. And you have to go to the ER at 2 in the morning. Okay, I'll drive you. You have, you want to talk. You need to go to the courthouse. And but eventually, like all of that report had to go in the book and it had to be written. And I've never heard a discussion among writers or journalists about to how to navigate that with when the people you're writing about, like their crises aren't in the past, their traumas aren't just something they're reflecting on and recollecting and now they're okay. Like, it's active, like their emergency doesn't stop because you've arbitrarily decided the book is, the narrative is done. That was crushing for me, is like, do I take this call, do I not? And I'm just putting that out there because that was really, really hard.
I feel that there's a story I report on for a couple of years in Alabama, a coal miner strike. That kind of saying I got so close to, like I was in group chats with all the wives, like they're my friends, and then it's like,
Hmm.
all right, time to go right. Like
Yeah, yeah,
check in once in a while, check in a little less often, check in, say happy birthday. It's like when you care that much on a human level, then having to pull away and be like, I'm sorry, I can't be here for you like this. I have to do the project. It does, it's like, oh
exactly.
man, was I like, it makes you feel bad.
Yeah, that felt like, I mean, more than this sort of like extractive question, and which is real and true, and I have definitely struggled with that too. and profiting off of these stories, like I'm making a career off of people's precarity. I mean, it's utterly perverse in so many ways, this entire arrangement. And we have to, I think, talk about that and be honest about that as journalists. But but also in a more intimate way, in like a relational way, especially when you're writing, like in your case, I know if you're writing about like strikers, like they kind of get that there needs to be something out in public, and that's why you're there to like put that out in public. But for several of the families I wrote about, or that I followed, they just weren't. It's like they even now, I think they're like, wait, you seriously wrote a book about this? Like, why is my story like, how is this political? How is this work? How is this something people want to read? Like to them, that wasn't, they weren't like, okay, go tell my story now. Go do your job. It was like there was a little bit of a disconnect, not with all of them. With some, it was like, yes, go tell the story. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
You're right. No one really talks about the exit interview or like the
Yeah.
pulling out of that big story. Because I mean, honestly, a lot of journalists don't get the opportunity, right, to actually have the resources to embed and follow a story that closely for so long.
Or
Even
maybe
if
you have the desire too. I don't want to, I, I've kind of, I mean, I love my, I'm sure you do, fellow journalists, but I've also been surprised at how, like, they're, I don't know, maybe this is part of like kind of the old style, like grizzled newsroom type journalists, just yeah, you have very clear boundaries about like what you're about professionally and who your sources are and what your sources are. And maybe that just shows up in the writing. Like maybe the writing lacks a degree of like detail or nuance or intimacy because of that kind of stance. But yeah, I think it's also about a desire. Like how much do we, even just as human beings, want to spend a significant amount of time around people who are are suffering, and especially whose suffering you're probably implicated in some way, as like a gentrifier or as a consumer or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
white guy with a bunch of PhDs following around a bunch of black families to church, it's got to feel kind of weird.
It feels weird. Yes.
I mean, I felt weird going down to Alabama and seeing people on strike and seeing people feel so much shame around going to the food pantry
Oh,
or worrying about getting their kids stuff. And then I would be like, all right, I gotta go back to
yeah.
Philly and
Yeah.
do my little work from home.
Yeah.
I'll see you next time I can get someone to pay for me to come down.
Yeah.
Hope you're good.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
think that you'll, now that the book, I mean, it just came out, but have you thought about how you're gonna like share it with the folks in it? Like, are they? I guess I'm sure you're gonna give them copies, but like, do
Yeah.
they have a sense that like we're doing events? Like,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
are they feeling now? How are they feeling now that it's coming out?
Yeah, it just kind of varies because some of them um, are just still really struggling. They're still in the midst of it. As much as I'm trying to help, as much, they're I don't want to say too much about that because they've only, they've consented to have what's in the book out there, and I'm trying to be really careful about how much I say about where are they now and that sort of thing. But yeah, some of it's also just really raw. They don't want to hear about these things, and I told them like I'm not writing it for you, really. I'm writing it for people to see what it's like. Like I don't want you to have to read about the most painful thing you've experienced in your life, unless you want to, of course, unless you feel like but don't feel like you need to for my sake, but I did sit down with all of them before the book came out and went over all of the material with them, and made sure that they were okay with it, even though they had consented, and, many times over the course of the reporting. Um, I just wanted to make sure that they were okay. I wanted to practice a kind of no surprises form of journalism where uh, it's better to just get it out before publication. So yeah, the launch event that's happening in here in Atlanta tomorrow. There's a few people from the book who are coming. Some of the families are coming. Others, I invited everyone, but yeah, I totally get like you are living your life, and maybe you don't want to revisit all of this stuff. But we're all we're I'm yeah, I'm in very close contact with all of them still. Yeah. I saw something in the chat just now about how we are neglecting the content of, I guess, we're talking too much about journalism. So
Oh,
I do want to be careful to, because
yeah,
I know
read
I
it.
could talk about, yeah, go read it, go buy it. Uh,
We could
um,
also, since since someone I can't see it, but since someone brought conversation about the content. Oh, all right.
all
She
right.
she's leaving, but okay. If other folks feel the same way, we could. If you would like to, okay. Since I guess for before we open it up to questions, and I had like one other question, but just to make sure we're scratching all the itches, could
Yeah.
you give us just a quick rundown of the folks who are in the book
Mhm.
and maybe just a quick ish synopsis of like what they're dealing with as you're following them?
Yeah. I mean, yes, this is the first time I have tried to do this, so it's gonna feel I could just like ramble on because they're so I mean they're all of their journeys are so complicated and hard, and there's so many different twists and turns. But yeah, just to do it relatively quickly, there's Celeste, whose story begin. She has three kids. Her story begins in the book when her rental home burns down, and uh, it's an abusive ex who is arrested for arson, and she had just taken a restraining order out on him, but her house burns down that she's been renting. And and I'm really at pains to show that her homelessness, even though the fire is this very dramatic thing, her homelessness was not caused by this dramatic fire. Her homelessness was caused by the fact that even though this rental home burned down, it was owned by a private equity firm that insisted she pay not only that month's rent, but the next month's rent if she wanted to get out of the lease, which she refused to do. And so lo and behold, unbeknownst to her, an eviction is filed against her that she finds out about months after the judge has already put the eviction order through. So her credit has been tanked without her knowledge. And because in Georgia, a tenant doesn't have to be notified in person of an eviction. So anyway, like that's how her story starts, and she's the one who ends up being diagnosed with cancer, and it's heartbreaking and awful. She ends up in this extended stay hotel efficiency lodge, and there's another family who we meet there, Michelle and her kids, who, when the story opens with Michelle, she is making dinner on Christmas Eve. And by the, yeah, and later in the book, she is mistaken by others as just like someone who's experienced like chronic homelessness, like on the street homelessness, because that's how quickly the situation can turn. And again, there's all these external forces, a lack of subsidized childcare that prevents her from being able to stay housed. And the book tries to do a lot or spend a lot of time with her teenage children, especially her son DJ, because it felt important to get the children and teenagers' perspective in this. There's Kara, who dreams of opening her own business, but she's mopping floors at a public hospital. When the book opens, and she prides herself on like, I can outwork any one of you men who I am on this floor at the hospital with, uh, as janitors. And even that kind of work ethic, even this like, I will outwork all of you, still isn't enough to keep her housed. Um, and then there is Natalia and Maurice, and they're a two-parent household. So, like, lest we assume that this is just a phenomenon of single parents or single women, single mothers. This is a two-parent household. They have middle-class aspirations. They grew up in DC, got priced out of gentrifying DC, and end up moving to the Black Mecca of Atlanta, only to find that in this city that used to be majority Black, it's now not a majority Black city, and yet 93% of families in this birthplace of the civil rights movement who are experiencing homelessness are Black. Like that's how disproportionate it is. They discover the reality of what Atlanta's like if you're not rich, and how these skyrocketing rents and again the lack of labor protections, the lack of of livable wages, of housing wages, even with two parents in the home isn't enough, and they end up in what they call their expensive prison of an awful extended stay hotel room. And finally, is that I think I oh, and then there's Brit. Last but not least, there's Brit. Brit is like a fourth or fifth, I think, fourth generation Atlantan, born and raised here. Um, and she takes pride in what her city is becoming. She loves like the new Atlanta, the shiny Atlanta, the Beltline, which is kind of like the High Line in New York, all these amenities. She loves like the converted warehouses into boutiques and all of that stuff, the bars, the nightlife. She loves it. And yet the title of the book comes from her because she is stably housed in a low income apartment complex that is next to the Beltline, and it's sold to this mega developer called Empire Communities, and she and scores of other families are forced out of their homes during the pandemic. And this neighborhood is being transformed, Britt returns like several months later after becoming homeless. She returns and she looks around. She's like, this place is nice, but there's no place for us here. And she just comes to terms with the fact that this city that I mean, almost she realizes that she herself is like a casualty of her city's renaissance. And that's a big theme in the book, is how this rampant gentrification, revitalization, transformation is in the service of capital. It's in the service of real estate capital, to be precise. And it's at the expense of tens of thousands of working and poor families and individuals who incidentally are also making that city and that success possible by their labor.
It's we hear so much about the housing crisis. There's housing, it's just people can't get into it because of all these systems and all these this powers that be, all the money. I mean, Philly's dealing with like the gentrification is gentrifying. Like we're one of those cities that's like we're a majority Black city. We're the poorest major city. We have incredible culture, incredible food, incredible people, and we're close enough to New York that people are starting to trickle down, and
Mm,
people's rent is starting to go up, and it's just that feeling of how long is it? How long are we people going to be able to last here? Like, is
totally.
anywhere safe?
Exactly. And just to again return to content super quick, like I don't want anyone to think this is an Atlanta story or a Philly story. And like, I mean, a statistic that I cite a lot because it's so striking, there is nowhere, not a single city, state, county in America where the local minimum wage, which is often higher than the federal minimum wage, is enough to afford that places, that city, that county's average rent for a two-bedroom apartment. Not a single place. And if you're disabled and you're dependent on SSI and fixed income, it's even worse. There is nowhere in America where SSI, and you're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to get extra income. So you're like trapped in this situation where your fixed income is not enough to have housing. And then we're like, who's to say what causes this skyrocketing homelessness in America? Who's to say what causes record high homeless? Like, is it immigration? Is it fentanyl? Like, no, it's the fact that people can't afford homes anymore. That is what is causing this. It's not rocket science.
Right. And that being said, before we there's a couple questions there. But that being said, how do we fix it? Easy little question for you. I'm sure you haven't spent much time thinking about
Yeah.
it.
Now I need to start. No. Um, I mean, there's so many ways to fix it. Or so many things that can be done, and there's like two broad categories that I talk about. Like one is keeping people in the homes they already have. So like that would be under the banner of preventing homelessness before it starts, which is shockingly absent in a lot of the discourse around even tackling homelessness solutions. It's all about like getting people off the street, but we need to make sure that people remain in the homes they already have. And that means tenant rights. That means tenant unions. That means organizing. That means passing even minimal tenant protections in a state like Georgia that where you can like withhold your rent if your roof is caving in, that sort of like keep people in the homes they already have a right to counsel in eviction cases, have just cause eviction regulations where someone can't choose not to renew your lease because they can't just not renew your lease because they want to make a killing on this property. Like they have to have a legit reason, that sort of thing. That would radically reduce the number of people who are being pushed into homelessness. And for those who are already without housing, you know, we need a massive public reinvestment in kind of public housing done right. Social housing is what it's called. But we don't need like thousands of units. We need millions of units. And that's why I'm so concerned in the book to say the magnitude of this crisis is so much worse than we've been told. And the reason I'm telling you that isn't to catastrophize and freak you out. It's to say we can't tell ourselves that these like a few tiny homes over here, a few supportive housing units over there, 80% AMI, 15 apartments over here, that's going to meaningfully address this catastrophe. We have to look at the full magnitude and scale and nature of the problem in order to then awaken to the necessity of widening our moral and political imagination to say, okay, how do we get this done? How do we get this number of safe, stable, permanently affordable housing units built? And that is through public housing done right, not allowing it to fail the way it did historically through racist disinvestment and so forth.
Because there are countries who have figured it out,
Because
maybe not perfected it, but they're doing a hell of a lot better.
there are a
Like, so you
lot.
know it's possible.
And it's possible. And all of this is recent. This crisis is recent. And it's important to remember that because if if there were very particular decisions and policies that got us here, then very particular decisions and policies, albeit bold ones, can get us out of it.
Hmm. And I can see that people are curious about that. I'm going to go into the Q&A ones, but just because I'm looking, Susanna was asking, are there politicians who are listening? Is there hope of remedying this nationally, but at a state and local level? Like you're paying attention. Who has some power is paying attention? Have you sent out copies of this book to Congress? Like, what do we got to do here?
Yeah, I mean, feel free. Anyone who wants to send this to, um, yeah, I mean, there are some who care about these issues. I mean, it can feel utopian right now to talk about social housing when it's like talking about decorating your living room and someone's like stripping all the wire out of your wall. That's like what's happening under the current administration. Even the minimal supports are being just decimated right now. So it can seem idealistic or utopian to be talking about we need to build more social housing, that sort of thing. But I really believe, like, I mean, we can talk about politicians who care about this and I appreciate that. But one thing I've come to realize in doing this project that I've changed my mind about, if change comes, it's not going to come because whether some Democrat or Republican wakes up and says, I want to help people. I want to make life easier. A lot of our policymakers on both sides of the aisle are landlords themselves, and the real estate lobby is really powerful. If this changes, it's going to be because tenants and their allies and people who are concerned about their neighbors and the state of their city and just have a soul and a moral compass, like say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore and we're going to organize against this and we're going to force this onto the agenda. That's how the eviction moratorium came to pass during the pandemic. It wasn't policymakers just out of the goodness of their heart saying we need to help you. It was tenants and their allies and in their organization saying, take us seriously. We are a lot of people and we vote and we will be really, really mad. And and active if you don't take us seriously. And that's how change happens, I believe.
Hmm. Now, kind of on that, I'm going back in the Q&A now. Kind of on that note, just in terms of thinking about systems of power and things that can be done, Shirley's asking, was there any intervention from the courts? How did the courts play a role in all this? And
Mm.
I have a feeling they're not it's not a very positive one, but I will hand that one to you.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you go to eviction court, it's one of the most devastating things you can witness because in a matter of minutes, if not seconds, people are just losing their homes left and right. And the thing you hear from judges is like, I don't need to hear the story. Did you pay your rent or did you not pay your rent? You didn't pay your rent? Okay, done. You're out. Like, there's no, uh, it's the law. And of course, the law varies from place to place, but the law is on the side of owners. The law is on the side of landlords. The law is on the side of real estate. And the courts impose that. That's when you even sort of are eligible to appear before a judge. So many of the families, like I said, they're living in these sort of gray zones, these hotels where they're not even allowed, like an eviction doesn't even have to be filed against them to put them out. They could just be locked out of their room, even if they've lived in that room for years. And even if they have the hotel address on their driver's license, which so many people I met do, or even if school buses pull up in the morning to pick your kids up at school at this hotel, doesn't matter if you miss 1 week of rent because you're getting chemotherapy, you're out. You don't get to appear before a judge. So in some sense, like the only thing worse than being a tenant in America is like not even being considered a tenant and like missing out on the minimal basic rights that other tenants might have in your city. So the courts are the courts. The court, you get more compassionate judges, you get judges who are more nakedly on the side of, the landlords and the owners, but the law is the law and they're there to enforce the law. So the laws need to change.
Mm. A couple of people were asking, kind of the same vibe. Does the book offer any avenues for giving help to these families? And have you chipped into their budget slash have you been asked to provide them with resources throughout the course of this book?
Mm.
Double whammy there.
Yeah, yeah. I am so to the first question, I'm in the process of trying to set up some kind of fund or trust where anyone who wants to like just give, I know there are a lot of people, especially and rich people and also people without a lot of money who just it's like they just feel like they want to give something. So I get that, and I'm trying to figure out a way where money could just come in and I could maybe divide it among the families and just still trying to work that out. But that's definitely a very strong desire, as well as giving any proceeds from the book and to them. Uh, but as far as like my own financial involvement with them or assistance, um, I had ground rules going into this with it, where I was like, I can't like here's what I'm here for, and I can't just like I'm no longer doing what I came to do if I'm like paying your rent at the hotel every week. Like now I'm documenting a journalist paying your rent every week and I'm but like so it's a very I mean we it was an awkward conversation. It was hard. It would be a lot easier to have a newsroom behind me that's like this is our policy, and I didn't have that. So a lot of it was sort of ad hoc, and it was like just trying to negotiate like but it actually didn't come up as much as I expect because there's a person in the book, Pink, LA Pink, who was the one who was giving, and she was with me all the time. So if someone needed food, she was the one who would buy them food, and I was kind of able to like stand behind her shoulder and watch as she gave of herself. And but I filled up people's gas tanks. I bought them grocery cards. I took them out. I did as much as I could. It's also 5 families, and I'm like, this is during the pandemic, and my wife isn't working, and like, but yeah, it was hard. I'm not going to minimize that how hard it was. but once the reporting was done and I sort of knew like, okay, what is in the book is in the book, those events have been captured. I gave myself more leeway in not just leeway, but I was like, okay, I got this advance for the book. I want to give something back to you. Let me pay your car note for the month. Let me, just do something. And yeah, so I've tried to be more active, but it's all a negotiation, especially when these are relationships, and yeah, it's fraught, but it's necessary to have that conversation.
The ethics are so yeah, that's one of those things. I think a lot of people don't realize that you're not supposed to pay sources. Like I've had sources for various stories like, oh, are you gonna pay me for this? Like this is my
Yeah,
time. Like I,
yeah,
I can't, it won't be the same. It's not like there's only so many like journalistic ethic things that I think are
yeah.
pretty,
I mean,
set up,
and if I
but
could just add one thing, I know we're like at 5 o'clock, and I'm also fine to stay on for another couple of minutes, but um, just one quick thing on that is like, it's important that people not feel coerced into continuing to work with you or cooperate. And I think a lot of people, even if you say like, okay, I'm going to give you this grocery card or this money, like now they feel like obligated to return your call. And I think it's really important. I mean, it's like that's another reason that I had to be like, I can't give you like these big sums because I don't want you to feel like you owe me something. Like we have to have as awkward as this relationship is, it is the nature of this particular relationship. And I don't want you to feel like you have to return my call because I did this thing for you. And so yeah, I think that has to be part of the equation as well.
sure. And they're all right. I want to take us out on a question from Deirdre, which I think is really nice placed. And also, my laptop's gonna die because it's really old and it's struggling. But are there suggestions in the book for action steps that people that read it can take around this issue, around these families, around just this crisis? Because, like you make very clear, a lot of people don't know this is even happening,
Yeah,
especially
yeah,
especially now at the real estate offices because they don't care. What can
yeah.
regular people who pick up this book do with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think because there's so many interlocking systems that are really overpowering the people I'm writing about, that you can sort of pick any one of them. If your thing is labor, like make it like find out how Starbucks workers are organizing and take part in that and help them. And it's like um whatever your interest. But yeah, as far as housing goes, like most cities in this country or counties, communities have some form of a tenant union or housing activist network. Like tap into that because they are going to be the ones who are connected to what people are struggling with if you yourself are not struggling. But if you just need solidarity because you're also on the brink of being pushed into this kind of precarity, like link up with others who are in a similar state and like yeah, and I see in the comment someone pointed this out, which is super important. Like also just open your eyes. Like look around you. Like ask yourself like this brewery that I'm hanging out in on Friday, like what used to be here? Like be curious about what your city looks like. In Atlanta, you're driving down the street and these roads are dotted with extended stay hotels. These are like for-profit homeless shelters that people don't realize are such. And so it's also about opening your eyes. It's about like getting out of the sort of self-imposed tunnel vision that I think a lot of us as residents of cities in America have put on ourselves. So I think it's also about just like an awareness, and I'm hoping the book can contribute to that, just like awakening people to what's happening, not on the fringes of society, but in their midst, like in the heart of their cities, the people powering their cities, the people making their cities and their, taking care of your kids, serving your food, cleaning your hotel room, like to awaken to the reality of what all of these people are not struggling with, but have, I would argue, been forced into.
Well, I'm so glad that this book exists now because I think it's going to be a really useful tool for people that want to get involved. I think it's it's just a really good book, man. I know
And
I don't really know, but I'm really proud of you.
and just to return the as someone with kids, especially with my 12-year-old, my son, who is really into like Appalachian labor organizing right now, and his favorite movies, Mate One and Harlan County, USA. We can't wait for your kids version. Yeah, I don't know if that's what you're calling it, teenage version of Fight Like Hell to come out soon because
Oh,
it's going to be amazing. So, uh, yes, everyone go pre-order. Fight to Win is the new one, right? Fight
yeah,
to
they
Win.
wouldn't let me swear in the title.
Everyone go find Fight to Win.
And that being said, thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you, New Republic. Thank you to Brian for all your work. Thanks for letting me be a part of it. Yeah, we did it.
Thank
Hell
you.
yeah. Public
And guys,
Tuesday. We did it.
whoever's still on here, I just want to leave with one like let's not allow our political and moral vision, imagination to be determined by what is like on our social media timeline, like in a particular moment, or what whoever is in the Oval Office at is like telling us we need to attend to. Like, this conversation is so exciting to me because it's just like grounding and reorienting to like, here's what matters. So thank you everyone for taking part in that.
All
All
right.
right. Bye.
Bye,
Take
everyone.
care.